So we are starting a new series today. Right now, I've only planned this to be a 4-week series. We'll see. These things tend to grow as we get into them. But this is a series called On This Rock. So far, it's shaping up to be about the life of Peter and Peter's journey, really from someone who was, in many ways, felt that he was a failure. He had denied Christ 3 times in the most crucial moment, but his journey to being a witness and a disciple maker, being someone that would lead and mentor the church and mentor others. And so this is a big journey of transformation that he took, and a journey that I hope we as individuals and that we as a church will take as well. I'm going to share a little bit this morning. We're going to be in John chapter 21. New American Commentary had a lot of great things to say about that, so if you want to dig deeper into it, I encourage you. That would be a good place to read, and if I have extraneous facts, that's probably where it came from this morning. But also there's a couple articles I'll share with you later that have been documenting this growing trend of the church in America to not share the gospel. Growing trend. I read an article this week, but even have found out over the past year, there's been numerous studies that have come out that Christians are no longer being witnesses to who Christ is. In fact, some millennials are even saying that they think, in fact, the number was like 47%, I'll have the article later, of millennials saying that they actually think it's wrong to share their faith with others. How is it? How can it be? When Jesus had said to his disciples, "You will be my witnesses," that we could find ourselves in that place so often of keeping quiet. But I want to challenge you that and say that this actually is not so strange of a place as you might realize. Maybe it's even a place that you found yourself at from time to time. A place where you're wondering, should I speak up about Christ? So today I want to talk about forgiveness in the midst of failure. We're going to look at the story of Peter immediately after the resurrection. So this is found in John chapter 21. After Jesus revealed himself to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way, Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples were together. And Peter said to them, "I'm going fishing." And all the other disciples said, "We'll go with you." They went and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. It was an empty catch. That's a very interesting situation. And some commentators debate, was this really a failure? Was this going backwards? But almost all commentators agree that the whole point of this chapter being in the book of John is to give Peter a story of redemption. How did he go from being the one who denied to the one who would lead the church? The reality is that we hear very little from Peter through the whole crucifixion and resurrection stories. In fact, we're told, as Jesus is on the cross, that he references John the Beloved. He references some of the other disciples, but he does not reference Peter. In fact, there are some that think that Peter, after the denial, stayed away for quite some time. But after the resurrection, we find that Peter is leading, and perhaps maybe in the wrong direction, or at minimally just going about trying to meet some practical needs. Maybe they were just hungry, is what some suggest. But the reality was that he had seen, likely, the risen Christ. We're told that he had run to the tomb. That was the one part of the story where he is mentioned. That he had seen the linens lying there, that he had seen the face cloth that Jesus had on his head, not lying with the other linens, but folded up by itself. He had likely been in the locked room where Jesus had appeared and showed everyone his hands and feet. But at this particular time, Peter finds himself heading backwards, in spite of all that he had witnessed. In fact, we had been told the story, and likely Peter was there, where Jesus had showed up in a room behind locked doors stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And he had showed them his hands and his feet. And the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I'm going to send you." And during that time, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they will be forgiven. If you withhold forgiveness from any, it is withheld." Peter wasn't mentioned by name, but most are pretty sure that he had received that message too. In fact, many believe, even though, again, he's not mentioned by name, that when Jesus appeared again to Thomas and all the other disciples, probably even Peter, had been telling Thomas, "We have seen the Lord." And Jesus let Thomas touch the scars in his hand and side. Jesus had explained everything from the scriptures about what had to happen with the crucifixion and his resurrection. Peter was likely there. But it seems there was something left undone. In John 21, it seems that Peter is in a difficult and different place. In fact, we're told all along the way, even just before the ascension of Christ into heaven, that there were many of the disciples who had doubted. Perhaps the gospel writers didn't want to call out Peter by name for that one either. How did he get to that spot? Why was he in that place? What was going on in his head? What was it that Jesus had to confront in him before the change could take place? Perhaps he was wrestling with inner turmoil. You see, Peter had been the one that had said, "Even if you die, and even if I must die with you, I won't deny you." He had made that statement to Jesus just prior to the garden. In fact, we're told in Matthew 26:35 that actually many of the disciples had said that as well. It wasn't just Peter, but Peter seemed to lead the charge. "Jesus said, it doesn't matter what happens. It doesn't matter what they do to you. Even if I have to give my own life for you, I won't deny you." He spoke with such courage, such commitment. He thought that he was loving enough. He thought that he was committed enough. He thought that he was ready to follow Jesus to the death. But he had been forced to come to the conclusion that he couldn't do it. Even when Jesus had warned him, told him what was coming, he couldn't believe that it would be him. He failed not once, not twice, but on 3 opportunities, denying that he ever even knew Jesus. And yet, as a fisherman, he had met Jesus. He had been called to. Jesus had said, "Follow me, come, and I will make you fishers of men." But instead of being a witness, instead of being a fisher of men, he likely viewed himself as a failure. He had failed at the one thing that Jesus had originally commissioned him to do. And after revealing himself after the resurrection, that Jesus commissioned his disciples to do. He had failed. He had failed the cause. And so perhaps had relegated himself to a place of passivity. And maybe even dragging others to that same place as they return to that pre-Christ life and comfort zone of fishing for fish. This was what he had known. This was what he was most qualified to do. This was maybe a self-imposed judgment, maybe an exile of himself back to a place that was easier, maybe relegating himself to the sidelines. Have you ever been in that spot? Maybe others think you can do it, but you yourself, it's over for me. That's all. I'm going to at least go back and do the one thing that I know. Have you ever been in that place? And then you try to do it, and even that comes up empty. No fish. What a failure. He was a fisherman that can't catch anything. And I know Harold loves to catch fish. He's going to do a fish fry for us. I think it's in June. And he catches fish every time he goes out. Me, I catch nothing, right? I go out there. I have rarely caught fish. There's probably been times in my life, but usually empty. But I don't call myself a fisherman, right? If you call yourself a fisherman, the assumption is you can catch something. And for Peter, it was empty. Shut down. Maybe it was the internal pressures or perhaps the external pressures as well. Maybe he had to find some way to make a living, to continue on, to provide for himself, maybe even just for the next meal. Perhaps there was no way that he could envision moving into the future that would actually work. Or perhaps it was that he could not forgive himself. Jesus, after the resurrection, told them what sins that they would forgive would be forgiven. What sins they wouldn't would not be. And perhaps that he felt that he could not forgive himself for his own failures. Now, we aren't told explicitly what was going on in Peter's head, but whatever it was, Jesus was not going to leave him that way. In John chapter 21, we're told just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore. Yet the disciples didn't realize it was him. And Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" And they answered him, "No." We've been out here all night. There's nothing. And he said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some." So they cast it, and they were not able to haul it all in because there were so many fish. And the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." John recognizes him first, evidently. And Peter, when he hears it's the Lord, ties up his outer garment because he had been stripped for work, and he threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in the boat, dragging it full of fish. Sure, they're thinking, "Come on, Peter, bail on us, help us out here." But they weren't far from land, just 100 yards off. So when they got onto the land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out on it and bread laid out on it. By the way, the last time, and I think the only time in the Gospels that you see specifically a charcoal fire, though it was probably a regular occurrence, but the only time it was ever mentioned was during Peter's denial around the fire. Fish laid out on it and bread, and Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So now Simon goes back, hauls the net ashore full of large fish, 153 of them. And by the way, commentators have wrestled, because almost, all these numbers in Scripture are usually symbolic. Nobody really knows why 153. About the only thing they can conclude is they counted them, and there was 153. And so even though there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." And so they eat, but we're told none of the disciples dared to ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was Jesus. It was like one of those things that it's like, okay, this is an odd experience. We've had this twice happen already. Let's just see what comes up here. So we're told they knew it was the Lord, and so Jesus came and he took the bread and he gave it to them. He gave them the fish, and this was the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now we see in this story that Peter has been very true to his character. He's impulsive, he's passionate, he jumps out of the boat. But Jesus knew there was something going on under the surface. He knew there was something holding Peter back. And so he confronted him right then and there to bring about a change that wouldn't happen immediately, but over the next 40 days or so would begin to change him dramatically. And this change happened just after breakfast. Verse 15. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now, there's some debate, but most people think he's either referring to all the fish in sort of an ironic thing, or then the other disciples. So we keep being told in John that there's this disciple that Jesus loved, and evidently maybe loved Jesus more because John was right there at the cross and everything. And so John doesn't call himself by name. He just says the the disciple that Jesus loved. And so some think it's maybe, Peter, do you love me more than the other disciples? And some think it's, do you love me more than the fish? Do you really want to go back to the fish? There's some debate over this. And so either way, Peter is like, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And so Jesus says, feed my lambs. He said the second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And then a third time, he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter at this point was grieved because he had said to him this a third time, do you love me? And he said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. And then he says something really weird. You ever read the gospel and you're like, Jesus, why would you say this? This is one of those where I'm like, this is strange. Okay, you just affirm Peter, really great. But then you tell him this. Truly, truly, I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress and walk yourself and wherever you wanted to go. But when you're old, you'll stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you don't want to go. And we're told in parenthetical expression, John including this, he says, this he said to show what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, Jesus said to him, follow me. So what happens here? Peter, being at his lowest point, needed a boost. And I think the catch of fish was the first boost of confidence. The fishermen who can't fish now all of a sudden having to haul so large that looks like the nets are going to break, but probably even in Scripture like some sort of miracle that this many fish didn't break the net. Okay, see, I can do it. At least I can catch fish. But oddly enough, and this was a New American Commentary one, it noticed that the disciples in the Gospels never catch fish except for with Jesus. It's always, I mean, it's kind of a funny story, but really, look for it, find it. They only catch fish when Jesus tells them to. It's just a bizarre little coincidence here. I'm sure there were probably literally other times, but in the gospel, it's like, oh, we can't do it. Jesus says, okay, catch the fish. Oh, man, look at all the fish. You know, it's like, hey, you want to pay taxes? Grab a fish. And they do, and there's money in its mouth, this kind of thing. So something about being with Jesus that helps them in this scenario. And I think this was initially an assurance to Peter, look, you're not a total failure. In that moment, he probably was thinking he was. But see, Jesus wanted to dig even deeper to what was happening in Peter's mind. Peter believed that he loved Jesus very deeply. And I believe it bothered him that Jesus had to ask him so many times. And it probably bothered Peter more than we can know that Peter had failed to live up to his own expectations of himself. He hadn't kept true to what he said. He hadn't followed Christ, being willing to give his own life. He couldn't be a witness if he was a denier. But Jesus told him what giving his life would really look like. Caring for his people. And Jesus commissioned Peter in this moment to be the one that would do actually what Jesus had been doing to that point. Jesus was the good shepherd, the one who took care of the flock, the only one who really could. The picture of God in the Old Testament actually is good shepherd, and here Jesus as good shepherd, the one who protects, that cares for, that feeds the flock. And now Jesus entrusts this mission to Peter. Feed my sheep. And so his calling is reiterated in spite of his failure. But what about this story about Peter dying? I think what Jesus is doing is saying, Peter, you'll have another chance. And that chance in the future, this time, you'll succeed. This time, your love, your commitment, your consistency, your courage will be there to be the kind of person that you always wanted to be for me, to have the kind of love that you always wanted to love me with, to be the kind of follower that you always wanted to be. Your inconsistencies, your failures, your sins will be overcome, and you will live true to the person that you want to be and who God has created you to be. Do you see how amazing that is? I don't think this was a scary thing for Peter. I think this was a hope-giving thing for Peter. You mean in the end, I'll live up to my expectations for myself and what I've always wanted to be, and I'll fulfill that calling that God has for me. You see, I think we want to be deeply courageous, deeply in love with God, deeply caring, deeply giving, willing to give our lives for Christ, often as Christ followers. I don't know about you, but I would want to, in a situation, be able to say, I would not renounce my faith. I used to hear stories when I was growing up. We'd have missionaries in our homes, and sometimes they would tell about going into communist Russia and smuggling Bibles, and man, what if they would get caught? What would they do? Would they stay true to the gospel? And sometimes God miraculously rescued them and saved them from situations. But there were other times they had to decide, do I say who I am? I'm a follower of Jesus, when it may cost them their own life. And I would like to think in those moments that that's what I would do. But I don't know if we really know until those moments come what would happen. And so Peter in those moments thought that's what he would do. But when his moment came, he said, I can't do it. I didn't know him. But Jesus said, there's a time coming when you will be able to say, in spite of your own life, I'm a Jesus follower. I'm a disciple of Jesus. And I'll go wherever you want to take me. If that's the cross upside down like tradition dictates, or if it was some other way, that Peter would be willing to live and give his whole life for his Savior. I think this is a beautiful, transforming message that Jesus gave him. This is what God is all about, transforming the failures of our life, redeeming them into something beautiful for him. I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of the message, that in many ways, many Christians, many of us, have often failed on a personal level. In a recent Barna poll conducted in conjunction with Lifeway Research, and an article I saw this week, I believe it was posted in Relevant Magazine, said, when asked how many times Christians have shared the gospel or how to become a Christian, 55% of Protestant church attendees, so these are people who go to church, not Catholics, Protestants, 55% over the course of 6 months said zero. None. Now, to be fair, some 24% of respondents did say maybe once or twice. 12% said maybe 3 to 5 times, 5% said 6 to 10 times, and 1% said 11 to 15. And there were 3% that said more than 15 times. And granted, some of those who said they didn't share about how to become a Christian did say that they did invite people to church, because that's easier to do, right? Oh yeah, how to become a Christian? I don't know, but go to church with me. You'll hear. In an earlier study, in a book that Barna is releasing called Reviving Evangelism, a report commissioned by Alpha USA looked at this question. And actually, people said, in general, that they believe that being a Christian means to be a witness. Actually, 95 to 97% of people believe this. Most of them, I believe it's around 94%, said they feel equipped to share the gospel, that when asked or if they needed to, they could explain it. But despite this, 47% of millennials say that it is wrong to share their faith or personal beliefs with someone of a different faith. And in spite of this, all these numbers, the fact of the matter is that Christians aren't doing it. Why is it? Perhaps we're scared. The answer seems to be that it's not that we don't know. Perhaps we don't want to be politically incorrect. We don't want to impose our beliefs on anyone else. We want to be tolerant. We want to be considerate. Maybe we believe that, maybe millennials believe particularly, that maybe just everybody else is just okay. It doesn't matter that they hear the faith. Maybe that's it. But I suspect in many ways it's because we're like Peter. Particularly those of us who are older. Those of us who maybe at one time felt like we could be a witness, but the reality of life smashed upon us. And we felt that maybe we failed. Or we feel like our message will be ignored. Or we don't want to be labeled a hypocrite. I think it's highlighted even more when this week, and I didn't get to the bottom of this, but I understand that even at a political level, was it the Kansas Supreme Court ruled that abortion was somehow a constitutional right. You see that article? How are we doing as a church, as individuals, as a community, in being witnesses for Jesus? And I don't think that it was just that the court went wrong on this. I think that our culture has shifted, and we as Christians have been wondering, can we hold back the tide of change that has been coming? And the reality is that we will only do that as we become vibrant witnesses as to who Jesus is. I believe today that Jesus wants to restore us, just as he restored Peter. Jesus isn't looking to condemn us as individuals or as a church, but to assure us that he still has a calling for us. He wants to commission us to take care of the next generation, to take care of his sheep, to be witnesses as he's called us to be the kind of people who live wholly and consistently, the kind of faith that they proclaim that they have. Jesus said to his disciples, "You will be my witnesses." We're going to look at that more in the coming weeks. What is that, to be a witness? Now, I find it funny after this restoration for Peter, after, he's told how that he's going to die. And I believe, again, this was encouraging, that it would be in a faithful way. And he's like, yeah, his next response is to look at the other disciples, and particularly the disciple whom Jesus loved, following them as they've been probably walking down the beach. Jesus had just said, "Follow me." So they're probably now walking down. And he looks at the one, and John's describing this is the one that leaned back during the supper and said, "Lord, who's going to betray you?" And along with Peter, said, "I wouldn't," but this guy, John, probably didn't have at least the same kind of betrayal, though they all had fled. And Peter says to Jesus, "Lord, what about him? What about this guy, the other one? What about this?" And Jesus said, if it's my will that he remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." And so the saying spread among all the other believers that this particular disciple wasn't going to die. And John tells us, but that's not really what was said. He just said, kind of brought up the question to Peter, what business of it is yours? I share that part of the story to say that I think a lot of times we receive our own assurances, we receive our own commission, but we want to focus on what everybody else is going to do in response. And I think, again, even in context, the question is bigger. I think that Peter's question isn't getting at, is he going to, live forever? I think Peter's actually getting at, you're assuring me that I'll die faithfully. What about John, that one who's close to you? Will he be faithful in his calling to the end? Or will he have failures like I did? Maybe he's curious. And will he live forever? That's kind of cool. Will he have the same kind of death? But Jesus says, really, in essence, focus on your mission, your calling, what Jesus has spoken to you. Be faithful with what he has told you to do. I want to end today with a little bit of time of personal reflection. I want to invite you to a little time of prayer and an exercise of thinking about this moment sort of reflectively. So if you would with me, if you'd bow your heads and close your eyes and imagine yourself in this kind of scenario, breakfast with Jesus on a beach, roasting some fish, having some bread. Jesus resurrected, Jesus who's demonstrated his power over death, hell, and the grave. Jesus who's been so loving and kind to prepare this breakfast for you and the other disciples. And just as he confronted Peter's calling, he addressed that by commissioning him. What would he say to you and your calling? Maybe in days past, whether in Sunday school or youth group, maybe you felt that call of God. You thought you would serve God with your life. You thought that you would serve him unwavering, passionately. Maybe you even felt a call to ministry, missions. Somewhere along the way, that seems to have dropped off. Maybe life hit you. Maybe you ended up back doing what you felt comfortable doing, or at least thought you knew how to do. Maybe you felt like a failure in your spiritual walk or your personal life. Jesus fed Peter. He fed him physically, but he also fed him the words that he needed to hear, to realize that God wasn't done with him yet. It's not over yet. There's still work to do. God's entrusting that work to you, to feed his sheep, to take care of the next generation. Each generation's only one generation away from not having a gospel witness. You're uniquely placed to be a witness, to show the love of Christ. Maybe you've relegated yourself to the sidelines, or you think it must be for somebody else. Like Peter today, Jesus has words of encouragement. Lord Jesus, I thank you. Thank you for what you did for Peter. I thank you for what you're doing today. I pray today that each individual that needs this message would hear your voice. Speak to them and assure them. One day, they'll be formed into the kind of person that is unwavering, willing to give it all when the time comes. And Lord, I pray for me. I pray that that would be who I would be. Lord, I pray for our congregation that that would be who we would be. Lord, that you would show us the path from here today. Lord, I pray for those that have found themselves in a place of failure, failing themselves, their own expectations, and maybe even failing yours, Lord, that today they would find instead freedom and grace. You would speak them words of your calling, that they would hear your voice. So I pray these things in the powerful name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, we're done a little early. We aren't going to do Delta groups today, but what I would encourage you to do is we're just going to have a little bit of time just with some background music, and if you want to stay and pray and dig into the Word, I encourage you to read John 21. You're welcome to do that. If you need to go, you're welcome to go. If you want to grab some coffee or drinks on the way out, feel free to do that. But let's just try to leave a spot for prayer. But before we do, we need to pray for a couple and send them off. I want to invite Bob and Linda and Keith and Tatiana to come up. And we want to pray for them as they head off on this new journey of life. And we look forward to hearing what God does. We have a little card for each of you.